And Father Ryan, in his invocation, the only invocation I can remember where we had applause in the middle of the invocation, but he let God know about Steve Neal's intelligence. And Steve Neal has that quality, but Steve Neal has other qualities, one of which, as every politician here knows, people read Steve Neal. One of the reasons, and I say this to my friends who are in the management of the Sun-Times, one of the reasons I think polls show people read columns more than editorials, which is contrary to what it was early in our history, is that we identify with someone. We used to identify with Horace Greeley or Charles Dana or Joseph Pulitzer, but now editorials are nameless kind of things, and they are not read as much as columns are generally. But Steve is not only a columnist who is well read. Steve brings another quality that I think is very important. David Gergen wrote a book on leadership. I don't remember the name of the book. But he said the great presidents I've worked with are people who have a sense of history. I think having that sense of history is very important for a president or a senator or a member of the House or anyone in position of influence. I think it is also extremely important for a journalist. And one of the things I like about Steve Neal is he has contributed so much, and here he is contributing again. If you haven't read, I'm going to put in a plug for another book of yours. If you haven't read his book on Harry Truman and Eleanor Roosevelt, you really get an insight into both people and an insight into our history reading that book. Anyway, Steve has enriched all of us, and he's going to enrich us again in about 1 minute. I have to grab a plane, so I'm going to go back there and find a seat somewhere, and I will leave, but it doesn't mean I'm disagreeing with what you say, Steve. All right? Steve Neal.
Thanks, Paul, and thank all of you for coming here today. I'd like to, first of all, note that this book I'm holding up here, HST, Memories of the Truman Years, is dedicated to Paul Simon and Dan Rostenkowski, because more than any two Illinois Democrats or any Democrats I know, one, Paul Simon helped bring back the bow tie, which Harry Truman wore, as you know, but Paul Simon and Dan Rostenkowski also stand for the same type of politics from our heartland that Harry Truman did, plain spoken, no nonsense, and they never forgot where they came from. And that, I think, is what defines Harry Truman and the two gentlemen to whom this book is dedicated. The other book, by the way, is dedicated to someone who's usually with us, not here today. That is the Miracle of 48, is dedicated to our friend Irv Kupcinet, who was one of Harry Truman's two favorite columnists. The other was the late Tom Stokes of Scripps Howard newspapers. And I can never say enough about Irv. But Irv was among the few reporters that predicted that this was not a miracle in 1948, that Harry Truman was going to win. I'd like to note that from my home state of Oregon, my mother Ellen Neal and my aunt Mary Helen Sokolowski. It's just great having you both in town. And I want to thank Clifton Truman Daniel, President Truman's grandson, who is also a member of the board of directors at the Truman Library and has written a terrific book about his grandfather, who wrote the foreword to this volume, HST. And Clifton has contributed enormously to his grandfather's legacy. and my friend Professor Robert Remini from the University of Illinois at Chicago, the preeminent Jacksonian scholar in our country. Andrew Jackson was Harry Truman's favorite president, and Professor Remini, in his foreword to Miracle of 48, writes vividly about that. And Bob, thank you so much, and Clifton, for your wonderful foreword. And if you wouldn't mind, when I'm done with a few remarks, I hope you can field a few questions. I also want to thank the people at the Southern Illinois University Press. Rick Stetter, would you stand up? Thanks, Rick. Rick is the director of the press, and these are my 9th and 10th books. I've done 3 books with the SIU Press. I have never had better production than I have with these 2 books I've seen today. The man who designed the books, Rich Hendel from the University of North Carolina, is legendary for design. And the typesetters, GNS from Austin, were wonderful. And Rick, thank you for finding such wonderful people. I'm very grateful. We have another volume, Truman volume, coming out called With Truman, The White House Diaries of Truman's high school classmate Charlie Ross. I don't know if any of you have seen the wonderful movie with Gary Sinise. The most genuine scene in the movie is when President Truman gets broken up over the death of Charlie Ross, who was his press secretary and was also a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and is one of my heroes. I mean, he was a great journalist and he was a great public servant, and Harry Truman liked him, which is enough for me. And I think that you'll enjoy the diary because it puts you there. And I thought I'd talk about a couple of these books. There was first of all, in talking about Miracle of 48, there was a book that came out a few years ago where the author of this book accused President Truman of excessive partisanship. Wow. I always thought that was the reason you had 2 parties in elections. And the thing that struck me in looking at the speeches and working with the original documents is how this was a campaign about issues, and many of the issues that he talked about, making health care accessible to all Americans, affordable housing, having a foreign policy that does not go it alone but works with allies and recognizes America's role as a citizen of the world, not the policeman for the world. And I think some of those themes come through in his speeches. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the 1948 campaign and then about the oral histories. If Harry Truman had decided not to seek the presidency in 1948, no one would have blamed him. For 3 years, the weight of the world had hung on his shoulders. He led the Grand Alliance to its final victory in World War II, and in May of 1948, he began rebuilding war-ravaged Europe through the Marshall Plan, which the Brookings Institution recently cited as the great achievement of government in the second half of the 20th century. And when Stalin threatened to starve West Berlin in June of 1948, this was the first major battle of the Cold War. He responded with restraint, and they had a humanitarian airlift that was the most successful airlift in history. And this stopped the Soviets. No other president had to make so many fateful decisions in so brief a time, and though he is now recognized in poll after poll as one of our great presidents, he was underappreciated and underestimated in that election year of 1948. After 16 years of Democratic government, a great many Americans were ready for change. And a Gallup poll showed that summer that only about a third of the American people approved of his job performance. But and then, to make this worse, the left and right wings of the Democratic Party split. Henry Wallace, the former vice president to Franklin D. Roosevelt, formed a progressive party on the left. Strom Thurmond, who was then the governor of South Carolina, organized a party known as the Dixiecrats on the right. And so a lot of people were suggesting, including the late Colonel Jacob Arvey of Chicago, who was the Democratic boss of our city at that time, but Democratic leaders across the country, that Truman shouldn't run because he couldn't win. Truman said, I had to run again and establish the Democratic Party as a national party, not just one representing certain elements. I was going to run if I got only one vote, my own. And he might not have gotten the nomination in Philadelphia if General Eisenhower had allowed his name to go forward. You may have seen in letters that were made, diaries that were made public by the Truman Library last summer, that President Truman had in fact offered to step down and run for vice president on a ticket headed by General Eisenhower. Eleanor Roosevelt and all of her sons thought that Ike was the only person who could win, and of course they assumed Ike was a Democrat because his career had been made by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Ike was not yet registered, as a matter of fact, and became president of a different sort, president of Columbia University that year. So the fact that he didn't run gave Truman a pretty clean shot at the nomination, but the convention was very gloomy. Nick Mellis, who is here today, told me about being there as a page at that convention, which had to be one of the great conventions. Michael Daley, the mayor's brother, has told me that his father, Richard J. Daley, was among the few Cook County Democrats who thought that President Truman deserved the party support and could win. Well, Truman gives this terrific acceptance speech where he outlines the difference between the major parties. He talks about the Democratic Party's legacy as the party of the people and defined the opposition as the party of privilege. The GOP, he said, still helps the rich and sticks a knife in the back of the poor. The Republican platform comes out for slum clearance and low rental housing. I've been trying to get them to pass this housing bill ever since they met the first time, and is still resting in the Rules Committee. The Republican platform urges expanding and increasing Social Security benefits, and yet when they had the opportunity, they took 750,000 people off the Social Security rolls. Then came his showstopper. He said, "My duty as president requires that I use every means within my power to get the laws the people need in such important matters, and I am therefore calling this Congress back into special session on the 26th of July. Now, his Republican opponent, Thomas E. Dewey, was a progressive Republican. In fact, Mario Cuomo once observed that he thought Dewey was probably the best governor that New York ever had. He was a terrific administrator. And Dewey did not like a lot of things that the right-wing Republican Congress had done. But Dewey also wasn't going to attack his party. So the Republicans did nothing when Truman called them into special session, so therefore he tagged them to do nothing 80th Congress and made the election of 1948 a referendum on that Congress, much as President Clinton very successfully in 1994, after losing both houses of Congress, turned the tables on Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott. President Truman understood the whole concept of a campaign is to motivate the voter, galvanize support for the candidate in the party. He believed it was possible to change the way that people thought, and that having the better argument was the best way to win elections. There never was a nonpartisan in politics, he once noted. A man cannot be nonpartisan and be effective in a political party. When he's in any party, he's partisan. He's got to be. And at the same time, I should note about President Truman, and one thing that I think is missing in our current president, Senator Simon has written in a book he did about the Supreme Court, that earlier administrations would reach across party lines to get the best people. President Truman had a former Republican Senate leader, Warren Austin of Vermont, as his ambassador to the UN. He had a Republican, Robert Abercrombie Lovett, as Secretary of Defense. A Republican, Roger Tubby, was his last press secretary. And Truman was very proud as a member of the Senate. He headed a group called the Truman Committee during World War II that evaluated our defense spending and our effort. He was very proud of the fact that there was never a minority report filed. They reached consensus. And when he was the chief judge of Jackson County, like being Cook County Board President in Kansas City, and they built all these roads. If you go to Kansas City, President Truman built a lot of those great roads. He worked very effectively with the civic leadership and with Republicans. And so it was less polarized, even though he could give a great partisan speech. In 1948, though, he uses his incumbency to establish special connections with some of the Democratic Party's key constituencies. His veto of Taft-Hartley was very important in getting organized labor out for him, and organized labor provided the rank-and-file precinct workers. His executive order in July that ended segregation in the armed services was described by Martin Luther King as the most significant presidential action since the Emancipation Proclamation. President Truman got a higher black vote than any Democratic candidate for president had ever received in 1948. And finally, against the advice of the State Department and the Defense Department, he recognized the Democratic State of Israel. And he got stronger support in the Jewish community even than Franklin D. Roosevelt. And this is extraordinary. In a letter he got from a Southern veteran of World War I who disagreed with his civil rights with the order to desegregate the armed services, he said, "If that ends up in my failure to be reelected, that failure will be in a good cause." And so when you if those of you who have an interest in looking at Miracle of 48, I think that election was won on issues as much as people liked his personal style and his personality. And I'll now like to talk a few minutes about the other book, which is, I was really glad that Professor Remini and Mel Hawley are here today. The University of Illinois at Chicago has launched something really exciting. They're doing an oral history project on the late Mayor Richard J. Daley. Before Sis Daley, one of the great women I've ever met and just a wonderful person, Professor Remini interviewed her a half dozen times, and so we will have, for history, Richard J. Daley's best friend and confidant, Eleanor Daley's memories of her husband, and you cannot beat that type of history. I was also glad to see recently that Mayor Bolandic, the late mayor, and the late Bill, your uncle, Judge Abraham Lincoln Marovitz, gave his papers to UIC, which is terrific because Judge Marovitz and Mayor Bolandic were two of this town's great public officials, and those papers with the Richard J. Daley papers at UIC are going to form one of the great libraries in our country for the study of urban history. Well, President Truman recognized the importance of oral history. And oral history, I should note, was sort of invented by someone who was an old friend of Paul Simon's and is from downstate Illinois, the late Allen Nevins. Allen Nevins is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. And when he was doing a biography of Grover Cleveland that many years ago, no one around Cleveland had interviewed him or his associates, and Nevins thought we should talk to some of these people. So Columbia University has this wonderful oral history project, and the Presidential Library started doing these, of which the Truman Library was the real pioneer. There are 460 of these oral histories at the Truman Library. Many of these you can read online. Some of them are not online, including some of those I put in this book. But I was struck by the quality of both the interviewers and the range of people they talked to for doing this book. They ranged from the artist Thomas Hart Benton, I think the best muralist in the history of American art. Unlike Nelson Rockefeller, when he censored Diego Rivera for doing the mural at Rockefeller Center, President Truman told Thomas Hart Benton, do whatever you want to do with one rule. President Truman would not be in the picture. And so we have Thomas Hart Benton's reminiscence, and I quote from, it was decided quite early, Benton said, that the mural would include Independence because it was the president's home as well as the site of the library. I thought at first that the president would also want to be included in the mural, but he very emphatically turned that down. He said he didn't want to be memorialized in the mural, that the library itself was enough in that line. Well, the people in this, of the 20 I chose, ranged from Konrad Adenauer, the great German leader who was threatened with imprisonment by the Nazis during World War II because of his opposition to Hitler, but who built West Germany with the help of President Truman. There are people like Dean Acheson, who was the son of the Anglican Bishop of Connecticut, who looked like a British figure from out of the 19th century, and yet was one of Harry Truman's best friends. And Chief Justice Earl Warren, one of the great jurists in American history, popular Republican governor of California, who was the Republican nominee for vice president in 1948, yet became so close to Harry Truman that he dedicated the Truman Library in 1957. There were two people of the 20 I chose that I was able to meet during when I worked a number of years ago in Washington as a correspondent. One was the late governor of New York, Averell Harriman, who was sort of the marathon man of American diplomacy, had dealt with the Soviet Union since it was founded, and was among the few confidants of President Roosevelt who stayed on with President Truman. And I got to interview Governor Harriman on a few occasions. The other person I knew of these 20 was Richard L. Strout. If some of you read the New Republic, there's a column in the New Republic called TRB. And for about 40 years, it was written by Dick Strout. And Strout was a great storyteller, great reporter, and he wrote like E.B. White. He was a great stylist. And let me share, if I could, a few of these memories I've selected a few. That this is from Dean Acheson, and this tells something of why, about the friendship between Acheson and Truman. He talked about this element of affection that they had. He said there were 100 things that built it up. Two people of quite different backgrounds became quite devoted to one another. It may be immodest to say, but the president's fond of me and I'm devoted to him. And the sort of thing that happened after I was secretary, you can't get them out of your mind. I had a younger daughter whom I'd done my best to spoil. She's very close to me. She got TB. For a long time, she was at Saranac, and toward the end, she had to have a dreadful operation. They took 7 ribs out of her back and part of the lung. It was very painful and very dangerous. My wife was there. She had 2 operations a month apart. She went through hell once and then had to sit through it again. I had to travel to San Francisco to make a speech. I was in San Francisco the day of the second operation. Until she was sailing along, Mr. Harry S. Truman telephoned me every single solitary day, sometimes to ask me the latest, sometimes to tell me Mrs. Truman would have gotten the latest from my wife. The girl is doing fine today. Or the boss gave me hell because I was to call you at 9 o'clock and it's now 10. She wanted to find out how Mary is. You can't write that into a prescription, but that was important because a lot of things sink into insignificance when you have that kind of a relationship. He talks about the formation of the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. He talked about when the British ambassador came and told how they were pulling out and that the U.S. would step in the eastern Mediterranean. And it said that after the first meeting with the British, General Marshall made a rather crisp statement on the thing and then stopped. The president had asked him to take over. It seemed to me these people were bewildered about it. Greece and Turkey were a long way off. It was rather cold. I asked the president if I could explain what the general said. I made a longer speech and pointed out the strategic aspects of this matter. The situation in Greece and Turkey was that if either one crumbled, the other would too. Acheson also says that they had after World War II, they still thought of these countries in terms of when they were the great powers rather than the U.S. was the great power. He said that it didn't really strike home to us. The British Empire was gone. The great power of France was gone. That Europe was made out of only 4 or 5 countries of 50 million people. I still looked at the map and saw the red on the thing, and by God, that was the British Empire, the French Senegalese troops in East Africa and in Germany. All this was gone to hell. And it was, of course, the Marshall Plan that brought Europe back. One of my favorite interviews in this book, a man named Paul Hoffman is born in Western Springs, went to Lyon Township High School, and he ran the Marshall Plan in Europe with Averell Harriman. Paul Hoffman's wife, I should note, was Anna Rosenberg, who was a great public official and who developed the GI Bill, which I think ranks with the Marshall Plan as one of the great positive accomplishments of our government. The 2 generals I chose as topics, one was General Omar Bradley, and the other was General Lucius Clay. General Bradley talks about the Berlin airlift, and he said that the first General Clay wanted a convoy. And Bradley says, General Clay recommended a military convoy, but the chiefs would never go along with it. I don't know whether it was right or wrong. Our contention was they might not oppose it by armed force, which would of course be war, but they could stop you in so many ways short of armed resistance. A bridge could go out or roads closed for repairs. They probably needed it at that time. Then you would look foolish running a train through there. A bridge could go out just ahead of you and then another bridge behind, and you'd be in a hell of a fix. But we decided on an airlift, and we won it. Maybe the other would have been better. I don't know, but I have my doubts. It might have led to considerable embarrassment. We would have been embarrassed if a bridge had been accidentally gone out front and back and left us sitting there, or they could have put nails in the road for our trucks, all sorts of things they could do to you. Now, Bradley also talks about his fellow 5-star general, General Douglas MacArthur. And he said that he's asked by the interviewer, where did General MacArthur go wrong? Bradley said, well, I mentioned one, the handling of troops, which was bad. This is in Korea. And then his attitude when we questioned him about it. Bradley was his boss as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He must have known that the president would see his message because all messages came to him, the president. He knew his answer would be sent to the president. If you will remember, the president went to Wake Island to see MacArthur over something he'd said beforehand. At the time, he assured the president that the Chinese would not come into this action. He just knew they would not, on which he was badly off. It was largely through MacArthur's recommendation I think that the UN took action to proceed north of the 38th parallel. General MacArthur sent back a plan which provided that he would move quickly into North Korea, hold elections, and pull back out except for South Korean troops. On this, he had the solid backing of Syngman Rhee, who was the leader of South Korea. They felt now that we had a chance to reunite Korea, and since the Chinese weren't coming in, it could be done quickly. These are the things, I think, the accumulations that caused the president to relieve him. First, his remarks, General MacArthur's remarks about Formosa. He wanted to bring Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese into the conflict, which would have inflamed the Mao in the People's Republic of China, or the veterans of foreign wars. That was the most flagrant thing, I think, was contrary to what the president was saying. Then along toward the end, when he was asked for his opinion about an armistice, General MacArthur went directly to the enemy with his own proposal before we cleared it with other nations. That was wrong. That was a straw that broke the camel's back. We had to apologize to our United Nations allies over something he had done, so that was when the president just finally gave up. Now, General Bradley is asked, would you say General MacArthur knew he was acting wrongly in the VFW message and other incidents? I think so, Bradley responded. General MacArthur has always pretty much gone his own way. I remember a remark made at the time by a general who was senior to MacArthur on the retired list. He said, quote, MacArthur said he never failed to obey an order. I never knew him when he did. And that was his reputation among his contemporaries. And of course, General Bradley, as you know, was regarded as by a lot of people as the greatest combat general of World War II, of the European theater. There are a couple others I would like to. Judge Sam Rosenman of New York is someone that Harry Truman had a great relationship. Sam Rosenman had been a justice of the New York Supreme Court, named by Governor Roosevelt when Roosevelt was governor of New York. And a lot of the New Dealers left. They sort of looked down on Truman as this sort of machine hack from the Midwest who talked sort of funny. The Roosevelt administration had not been for President Truman when he ran for re-election to the Senate in 1940. But as Sam Rosenman notes in this oral history, President Roosevelt was very impressed by Senator Truman's performance as head of the Truman Committee during World War II. But Sam Rosenman had a unique perspective on the two, Roosevelt and Truman. This is what he said. He said, I think there were differences in personality that were very apparent. Their mannerisms, their general approach were obviously different, and those differences, of course, became very noticeable during Truman's first couple of months in the White House. President Roosevelt was more equipped toward leadership into new fields than President Truman was, so far as the difference between the way they handled a job. I think they were very similar with one major exception, and that is that President Truman paid much less attention to what his actions were doing toward his chances for re-election than Roosevelt did. President Truman did a great many things that Roosevelt, because he knew the effect it would have, never would have done. For example, seizing the steel works. Seizing the railroads was a different thing, but seizing all the steel plants, which led, as you know, to a fight in the courts, was something that Truman thought was necessary, thought it ought to be done, and once he made up his mind, he had no thoughts about the political effect or about his re-election. Roosevelt always was conscious of the fact that it wouldn't be of any use for him to be sitting under a tree in Hyde Park if he wanted to continue doing anything about all the pressing problems, that the only place he could do anything about them was in the White House, and he was willing to make many compromises so that he would last to fight another day, as they say. I don't think Truman ever had that in mind, and I think that sums up a lot of Harry Truman's style. James Rowe was someone who worked for presidents from Franklin D. Roosevelt to his close friend Lyndon Johnson. And Jim Rowe talks a little bit here about, he said, when Franklin Roosevelt died, he says, I think that at the time the atmosphere was such that the New Dealers thought Roosevelt was perfect, and therefore no matter who went in, if God had replaced him, he wouldn't have satisfied them. I think that's part of it. Truman didn't like the New Dealers very much and said so. I think it's only human nature we weren't too fond of him. There are a number of minor things that he talks about where they differed, but he said, I think looking back on the tremendous things he did, mostly in foreign affairs, the Marshall Plan, Korea, I think maybe those things 25 years ago have given us what you can't, peace, but at least not hot war. I think in the foreign field he was tremendous. And Harry Truman was comfortable when he made a decision. He had a man named John Steelman, was a former academic, who was the first person to have the title of assistant to the president. And he came to President Truman and told the president that he said that, Mr. President, I think you made a mistake last night. And he suggested a plan B for him. President Truman responded. He said, well, you may be right, but if I spent today reconsidering and rehashing some decisions that I made yesterday, then all the decisions I've got to make today wouldn't be made at all. And that would be wrong. So he told me how he worked. He said, when I make a decision, it is eternally right from there on, regardless. That reminds me of a former chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. A couple of quotes, if I can read at the end, that I think sum up Truman. I chose these for the back of the jacket. Dean Acheson talked about Truman. Acheson, of course, is a graduate of Yale. His papers are at Yale, and was the total Ivy Leaguer. But he said of Harry Truman, he had a remarkable education. Mr. Truman read every book in the Independence Library, which had about 3,500 to 5,000 volumes, including 3 encyclopedias. And he read them all the way through. He took in a hell of a lot more out of that effort, which he took out of farming when he did it, than he would listen to all the crap that goes on at Yale and Harvard. I thought that was pretty good from Dean Acheson. Governor Harriman says that everybody gave General Marshall credit for the Marshall Plan. I don't want to take one iota of credit for the Marshall Plan, but there's one man who's responsible for the Marshall Plan, and that was Harry S. Truman, because he developed the plan and got it through Congress. But as Tip O'Neill said, that you can get anything done if you don't care about authorship, and that was Truman had less ego, I think, than any president I can think of modern times. Dick Strout had a wonderful line. He talked about how President Truman had the disadvantage of following a famous president, and we all tended to decry him and minimize him, and I think also certainly underestimate him until in his own right in 1948 he'd won this amazing election. And there was a poll that Newsweek did of 50 experts who's going to win the election. It was 50-0, Thomas E. Dewey. And who would be the better president? Truman did a little better. He got 5 votes. And so he was Chief Justice Warren, in his oral history, who was the most popular governor, probably the most enduringly popular political figure in the history of the state of California. He won 3 terms as governor, came very close. They had a system then called cross-filing, in which you could win the nominations of both parties. And so Governor Warren won 3 terms by huge margins. And when Governor Dewey chose him as the Republican vice presidential nominee in 1948, many people, including Mrs. Roosevelt, thought it was over. But Justice Warren said in his oral history about the miracle of 48, the main reason that he was elected was because he was such a plain and simple man going out on his own on a whirlwind trip to talk with the people, whereas Governor Dewey was talking at them, and there's a great difference. I was on the ticket against Mr. Truman and ended up with his friendship. And I hope some of you enjoy these memories of the Truman years. I had a lot of fun working with them, and if Clifton and Bob would not mind coming up to help field a few questions, I'd be grateful. Clifton, thank you.
Steve, maybe you want to say something?
Yeah, you guys, why don't you make a couple?
Yeah. Age before beauty. Now watch, there'll be no questions at all.
Here, hold on. Oh, hold on, come here. Why don't you talk a little bit about the book and then introduce Professor Remini, and then where's Dr. Green? Paul?
Right here, sir.
Paul, and then you can come up here and ask, get the questions going. How's that?
Okay.
Clifton, Truman, Daniel.
Thanks a lot for giving me a job that I was absolutely not prepared for. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate that. They had a bunch of us together last week, early in the week, I think it was, to talk about Steve for the University of Oregon, his alma mater. They are enshrining him to a degree, giving him well-deserved honors. And they interviewed, several of you in the room were probably in the hot seat before or after I was. And they asked they asked me at one point, they said, well, tell us how you know Steve. Tell us, give us the details of your relationship. And I said, well, mostly I know Steve through lunch. I mostly have lunch with Steve. I come here once a year and I have lunch with Steve. And the first time I met Steve, I had lunch with him. I'm not sure that Steve eats any other meal but lunch. And the guy said an interesting thing. He frowned when I said that. And he said, a lot of people have been saying that today. So I'm stuck knowing Steve primarily through his writing. I read Steve. I've read his books. I haven't read every one yet. I'll get there. I couldn't stay up late enough last night to read all 5 of them before I came here today. But I love his writing. He has that rare gift to make history, to make complicated issues accessible, to make them fun to read. My grandfather would certainly have appreciated that. He was a plain-spoken man. He liked things laid out for him, and he would very much have appreciated having Steve Neal write about him. Without further ado, I will introduce Professor Remini. And again, I apologize for being unprepared. Everybody in the room probably knows more about the curriculum vitae than I do, but I'm delighted to see you again, sir. Thank you.
Wonderful seeing you. Let me add my word about Steve. You know him as a journalist mostly, as a commentator. I know him as a historian. And that, I think, is what makes his commentaries so valuable. They have the insight of American history. Not only has he read it, he's researched it. He's gone to the Truman Library, to the Eisenhower Library, to the Roosevelt Library, to the Library of Congress, and actually dug into the materials. And that's what he can bring in discussing politics and issues today. And when I was asked to write about an introduction to the miracle of 48, it reminded me of something that had happened back in 48. I was a young instructor at Fordham University, and I knew American history and was about to share it with my students. And when the Democratic Party split, as Steve indicated, on the left and on the right, it reminded me of 1860, when the Democratic Party split and the Republican, Abraham Lincoln, was elected. So I said to my students, this is why you study history. Knowing what happened in 1860, I can assure you that Truman can't win. Boy, did I learn something about history. And it happened a second time, too, when Jimmy Carter was running for the nomination. And I was in Tehran. The State Department had sent me over to talk about Jacksonian democracy. And these people said, Jimmy Carter, could he be nominated and elected? I said, no way. The American people would never elect somebody whose name is Jimmy. In this book of the miracle of 48, you get the feeling of this extraordinary man who wouldn't compromise with what he believed, who really stood for something. And he knew the American people would listen. And that he was able, with all of the disadvantages of a fractured party, of a popularity that was down to about 24% or so, to pull it out and prove once again why this country is so unique in the family of nations. I must tell you, too, that I am now presently writing the history of the House of Representatives as mandated by Congress. And this is why I speak with the chairman, and he had the history of the Ways and Means Committee written up for us. And the Ways and Means Committee was the first most powerful committee to run the affairs of this country. And that man ran Ways and Means. He and I are going to appear next month in a conference on the living speakers, Gingrich, Wright, Foley, Hastert. And I'm dying to hear what he has to say because he has so many great stories to tell, as does this man who not only knows the present, and you all know him, although I think there are some politicians who wish they didn't, of what history can do in providing that kind of information that can enrich your own life and make it clear why this country has endured and will continue to do so. Well, I'm not sure I answered.
We'll take a couple of questions and editorial comment. You should be really happy that you're in this room today. This is really like Professor Remini. I used to work for Professor Remini a short period of time till he wised up.
He was my student.
Steve Neal, you're learning, you're listening, and you're enjoying, and this is what education should be all about. And those of us who've been in it for a while would only dream about being able to do this kind of thing off the top of our heads. So let's take a couple of quick questions and go to the microphone, race to the microphone. First is with the mostest, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and we'll get there, and no bumping. Yes?
I'm going to ask Professor Reimer.
Remini.
Do you think that in an era where it takes millions and millions just to get a nomination, when we hear that the Bush campaign has already raised $80 million pre-election, pre-everything, do you think someone like Truman could make an impact, get their message across, unless they had the big pocket people behind them? Could Truman do it today?
Well, a man like Truman, I think, might just pull it out. It does take a great deal of money. It has always been true that money is important in any campaign. Today, of course, it is in the tens of millions of dollars. And you wonder whether a trip across the country by train would attract enough people to hear the message. And I think a man like Truman might have found the ways by which you do. But it's an iffy question. And it's like my prediction of 1948.
Bob, I'll weigh in. I think that, yes, what you've seen with Governor Dean's candidacy, a guy who was at single digits in the polls, raising more money than has ever been raised, more contributors who've ever given in the history of Democratic presidential politics, that clearly people still do respond to plain talk. This is a very strong Democratic presidential field. I can't recall, including 1960, a Democratic presidential field when you've had people like General Wesley Clark, Senator John Kerry, House Minority Leader Dick Gephardt, and Governor Dean, and I'm leaving out Senator John Edwards, and Senator Graham, who just dropped out, was a terrific governor of Florida. Didn't do too well as a candidate, but this is a very strong field. But clearly the response that Governor Dean has gotten, I think, is to his Truman-esque plain talk. And there is Lincoln. Could a Lincoln win today? I don't know. But I do think that the issues that Lincoln, Truman, Jackson talk about are ageless and timeless issues that people do. The American people have a lot of common sense, and the American people are usually ahead of their leaders.
One more.
My name is Chris Long. My question, I'd like to follow up sort of on what you just said, Steve, though. The only way that people hear the message is either through pay TV or through the press. Pay TV is where the money is going. And that's a real problem, because there is no way that any of the Democratic candidates will have as much money going into paid TV as the president will have, unfortunately.
That's true. President Bush is talking about raising $200 million. But remember, John Connally raised more money in 1980 than anyone in the history of presidential politics. Phil Gramm of Texas said that money, he would be able to buy the presidency in 1996 because he would raise more money. So I think, again, the American people see through, big money, and they make their choices. I mean, I think Arthur Schlesinger is correct when he talks about the cycles of American history, and American politics throughout the last century has gone back and forth between periods of reform and periods of conservatism. And so, yeah, clearly money keeps some good people out of the race. But there are also an awful lot of ordinary people giving and responding, and people like Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter did not start out with big money, and Bob Dole didn't have as much money as Senator Graham of Texas did at the start. So I do think that a strong message and a strong record still matters, and that the Democratic Party is very fortunate to have a strong field this time. I think this field stacks up very favorably with their fields of 1960 and 1976 and 1992 when they won back the White House. And I think this field.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Here's my real question, which
That was a
is,
phony question.
well, that was a comment. You know me. My real question is there are several references to the Dixiecrats as having been right. Now, that is to say, at the right end of the Democratic Party. Even at the time, and I was just a kid at the time, I remember my parents referring to the Dixiecrats as the racist wing of the Democratic Party. Would you comment on how you could call what Strom Thurmond did right wing?
Well, Chris,
I don't get it.
let me ask you a question. Do you know in the history of the Democratic Party, the first Democratic National Convention where there was an African-American delegate? 1936. There was all white delegates to the Democratic Party because it was dominated by the South. FDR never spoke out against, and so they were racial conservatives, and what Strom Thurmond clearly when Trent Lott made his comments about Senator Thurmond, the Bush White House responded that was no longer acceptable. But at the time, when Harry Truman did this, 8% of the American people supported his civil rights initiative when he presented that before Congress in the winter of 1948. And the Democratic Party, yes, it was the right wing of the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was predominantly Southern in Congress. The Southern chairman had the seniority, had the chairmanships. And so, yes, I think just the same way one could make the same argument was Henry Wallace left. Henry Wallace, we now know, bought into a lot of the CPUSA and the Soviet line, even though he himself was a good man. But I think the liberal wing of the Democratic Party was Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, and Truman had conservatives around him, but who were not racial conservatives. But the country, it is in 1948. It is remarkable that, as what Professor Remini said, it looked like there was no way he could pull this off because Franklin Roosevelt never lost a southern state. Harry Truman lost half of the South because of this courageous stand that he took. And there were, and they also got a pretty decent popular vote. But President Truman only made one appearance he made two in southern states. One was in North Carolina, and one was in Texas. And Thurmond had, a lot of it locked up.
I was just troubled by the identifying of racism with conservatism, even though I'm no conservative.
Well, I think at that, in 1964, as I recall, when Barry Goldwater was the Republican Party was the party of inclusion historically, and they've had a problem since 1964 when Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Bill. and Ronald Reagan approached, though a great president, you know, in some ways in his foreign policy, I think did some good things. Talked with Gorbachev, certainly in the area of race, left much to be desired.
Hold it, hold it, hold it.